today specifically is work by Klepper, the West Texas Mystique. Edan is a contemporary writer and photographer based in Marathon, Texas, so Big Bend country for those of you not as familiar with West Texas. He's talking to us about his work today and also about his fantastic book, Why the Raven Calls the Canyon, which was published last year through Texas A&M University Press and is a really beautiful writing and photographic display of which we'll talk more about right now. So thank you, and here's Edan.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thanks everybody for showing up and fighting the traffic to get here and not going to the art car parade instead, or maybe you did and then you came here. So like Sarah said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experiences in doing a lot of in creating a lot of the images that you see here today, and many of them are in my book, which is available here if anybody's interested after you hear me go on and on and on about it. How many people have actually been out to West Texas? Everybody, right? Just about. And I've been out in West Texas for about 18 years. I was born and raised in San Antonio and spent a lot of time in the north. And then when I moved back to Texas, I eventually ended up in a little town called Marathon, which is kind of a gateway to Big Bend National Park. Even though it's 50 miles away, they still call it the gateway. And I'm based out of there. I have a studio gallery where I do a lot of photography and I do a lot of freelance work, magazine work. I'm a contributing editor for Texas Highways magazine, and I also do a lot of architectural pieces. Some of these large pieces are designed for architectural spaces, and so I do sell some work out of the gallery, and then I also do commission work as well. And so that allows me to live out there and kind of live the way that I want to live and have my time as my own to schedule. And I'm not a millionaire by any stretch of the imagination, but living in West Texas is a high quality of life and a low cost of living. If you've been out there, if you're not, I'm sure if you've been out there as a tourist and you're out camping, it's not necessarily inexpensive, but if you are living out there, it's still a place in Texas where you can, depending on where you live, you can choose to do what you want with your life and take odd jobs and live very inexpensively. And you can't say that about a lot of places in the world. And of course, that probably won't last in West Texas, but the reason I did move out there is because I recognize that not only is this a beautiful landscape that inspires me, but it's also a window of opportunity to live in a place that's very 19th century with all the 21st century conveniences. And for those of you that have been out to West Texas, you realize that it's just there's a lot of country out there, and it's not a whole lot of people. And but it's just a big sky country. They talk about Montana being big skies, but it's just really a massive stage on which nature kind of performs and plays out all kinds of events. And so that was the primary reason that I moved out there, and ended up spending about 7 years, which is what this book is about, traveling back and forth between my home in Marathon and an abandoned horse-and-mule operation at a ranch of about 7,000 acres along the Rio Grande, just west of Lajitas. If anybody has driven through the river road, they'll drive through Lajitas. And this ranch was in private hands for many, many years. At one point, it belonged to Gene Norsworthy, who's a late Jean Norsworthy, Texas painter, who is also the granddaughter of George B. Dealey, who's the publisher of Dallas Morning News. And so it has a considerable amount of history. That place is pretty much what the book is about and what many of these images are about. So what I'd like to do, instead of just rattling on about that, is like read a little bit about from the book, and it'll give you an idea of what this experience is and what these images are really about. So. If everyone turns to hymn number 2. From 2006 to 2013, I divided my time between Marathon, 15 miles north of Big Bend National Park, and Fresno Ranch, an abandoned off-the-grid horse-and-mule operation located along the Rio Grande. Relatively uninhabited for almost a decade, the ranch encompassed more than 7,000 acres of springs, canyons, and volcanic peaks. In 2006, absentee owners recruited Rodrigo Trevizo, a friend of mine and local state park superintendent, to keep an eye on the place. 2 years later, he moved into the ranch's adobe studio, determined to bring the rudimentary infrastructure of the ranch back to life. I joined him for weeks at a time, lending a hand to unearth the ranch's water system, repair livestock corrals, and restore the solar power, all the while adjusting to the day-to-day challenges of living off the grid. With Trevizo's help, Fresno became part of Big Bend Ranch State Park at over 300,000 acres, the largest state park in Texas. Fresno Ranch was established in the 1900s as a 640-acre section bordered by the river at its confluence with Fresno Creek and present-day FM 170, which is the river road. During the 1980s, another 10 sections were added, including 9 sections up Fresno Canyon and an additional mile of riverfront. At one point, Fresno also covered the Picachos, a 5,000-acre ranch directly across the river in Mexico. Ancient campsites and historic ruins litter the desert terrain around Fresno, sharing a robust cultural history with defunct mercury mines and remnant Candelia wax camps. A collapsed magma dome, so large it can be detected from space, dominates much of the ranch's northeastern horizon. Among Fresno's hand-built attributes, a 2,000 square foot adobe painting studio lies at its heart, constructed for the late Jean Norsworthy, Texas artist and granddaughter of George B. Dealey, publisher of the Dallas Morning News. So there are a couple of images here that show, this is right across from the studio, so when you look at some of these landscapes really show you a little bit of what the book is about. And what you're looking at are these cliffs getting struck by lightning. That's actually Mexico. This is a little bit about just what the country that surrounds the studio and the ranch. The windows in the Fresno Ranch studio, a hand-built adobe measuring 75 feet long by 30 feet wide, run end to end. The north-facing views include the shark fin slopes of the 36-million-year-old collapsed magma dome known as the Solitario. The dome's sawtooth profile serves as a backdrop for oddities like the wax factory laccolith, an igneous peak that rises like a giant chess piece wearing a jagged crown. The laccolith lies 4 miles up Fresno Canyon from the studio, but it seems to grow much closer throughout the day until sundown, when it suddenly shrinks to the size of a rook in the palm of your hand. A long walk to the laccolith begins down a ridge of compacted volcanic tuff and then over creosote flats before dropping into Fresno Canyon. Desert willows thrive along the canyonway, nourished by streamlets that grow stringy algae before the water disappears beneath the gravel of the canyon floor. Egrets, killdeer, javelinas, ringtails, kangaroo rats, and the occasional great blue heron leave their prints in the wet sand. Mountain lions frequent the canyon, including mother cats leading their young to the river, 2 kittens at a time. Out the adobe south-facing windows, the slopes of Mexico's Sierra Rica mountain range give way to a hummocks of short grass mesas and ocotillos before dropping abruptly into the Rio Grande. The highest peak, also known as Sierra Rica, is a prominent feature of the range and landmark for the Canyon de Santa Elena, a protected area for flora and fauna in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. The Mexican communities of Santa Elena, San Carlos, and Nueva Lajitas lie within the zone, as well as federally owned land, communal ejidos, old mining operations, and privately owned parcels. But the region's remoteness and sparse services have discouraged full-scale development, leaving much of the zone uninhabited. Between the Sierra Rica cliffs and Fresno's share of the riverbank, a streamer of fog appears where chilled air meets the warmer Rio Grande, creating a low-lying mist that floats above the surface. The first time I encountered the effect, I mistook it for a trail of smoke. Along the open stretches of river, the fog dissipates in the sun, but near the river's confluence with Fresno Creek, the fog grows denser, rising slowly like a puffy cloud. An abandoned rock and adobe house occupies a small creosote flat near the confluence. The interior has collapsed, but the exterior remains intact, and the sharp edges of its outside walls, checkered in locally gathered stone, distinguish it from the surrounding brush. If you know where to look, the ruin can be seen from the studio, even on a moonlit night. Dark squares on each side of the low, dark doorway combine with a rock pattern wall to replicate the look of surprise on a pixelated face. Above the ruin and in the shadow of the rising palisades are 3 grave sites marked by stone mounds. One is smaller than the other 2, covering the remains of a child who drowned in a bucket. Cheerful, isn't it? When you submit a manuscript to an academic press, they have a process that they have these anonymous readers that will look at the manuscript and they'll read through it and they'll decide whether it's worthy of getting printed. And so, of course, this manuscript had to go through the same process, and the author is allowed to review they're allowed to look at the notes that the reviewers write down. And so, being completely overly confident and a megalomaniac, I assumed that they would just come back with raving reviews. And, they did. But there were a couple of critiques, and one was that it was just a little short paragraph and said, well, we love the photos, the writing is terrific, but maybe he could include less dog photos. So I ignored that advice. So part of the, there's a lot of wildlife down on this ranch, and but there's also a lot of feral domestic wildlife that comes over to Mexico and goes back and forth. Cows, lots of burros, pigs, and but there were a number of dogs, and I had several dogs, and Mr. Treviso had a number of dogs, and so there were a lot of dogs, and they, anybody that's got dogs, they're great companions, especially if you live out on a ranch, and they just have essentially all this freedom. And so I photographed everything at Fresno those 7 years, just what I do. And so, of course, there were a lot of photographs of dogs, and so I included a lot of them in the book. So this chapter is about a lot of the dogs. Dogs were constant companions at Fresno, beginning with 2 old yellow labs Treviso adopted. They had never been separated, living first at the ranch and then in Presidio with Treviso's parents, who doted on them, feeding them homemade tortillas. A pair of blue heelers assumed the role of Fresno's alpha dogs, shedding litters of pups and ruling the rescues Treviso picked up along FM 170. Most of the pups and rescues survived, but few were lost to disease, snakebite, and accidents. Old age took my own longtime companion, a shaggy red cur named Mary Jane. She loved to splash in the canyon shallows and then wander off. Excuse me. A habit rare in the healer pair and their offspring, who stuck with us everywhere we went. The dogs shared an enthusiasm for sneaking up behind the horses, charging their fetlocks and dodging their half-hearted kicks. They considered the maneuver a game, but it was a nuisance to the horses. Only one dog in the pack, an old copper-colored mongrel named Cowboy Penny, avoided the horses' hindquarters. Penny lived in Presidio, but Treviso brought him to the ranch for a change of scenery. The dog knew the consequences of the game firsthand, having lost an eyeball to a kick in the head when he was 2. The trail from the studio to the river, used by the dogs, the horses, and humans, crossed the lower pasture where a line of boulders were arranged next to an iron sled. The sled was the previous owner's stone boat, constructed to quarry the boulders and big slabs of rock he discovered in the canyon. From here, the landscape gradually sloped toward the canyon confluence with the Rio Grande, creating Fresno Rapids. Beyond the rapids, the Palisades of the Sierra Ricas formed a cliff face where the river eroded and undercut in the rock, undetectable below the surface. At times, the current slammed canoes and kayaks into the rough wall at the cut, catching and swamping the boats before they had a chance to maneuver the riffles. The dogs loved to swim in the river where the cliff made a natural backboard for their favorite game of chuck-it ball. The game required slinging a bright yellow tennis ball from a long-handled scoop, striking the rock wall, and bouncing the ball into the river. The dogs competed to fetch the ball, diving and swimming against the current. Sometimes the ball lodged in a crevice beyond the dog's reach, an unintended consequence of using the pitted cliff as a ricochet. I swim the river, scale the cliff, and retrieve the ball myself. I snagged a ball in a shallow outcrop too sheer to reach after one vigorous toss, so I left it stuck in the cliff. The fluorescent ball flagged a spot below a metal post that marked a skinny livestock trail linking pastures on the side of the cliff. Any early morning sounds of whoops and bellows coming from the river alerted me to a slow-moving chain of goats, cows, and cowboys working the cliff trail. Viewed from the studio window, the procession looked like a hat trick, as if the livestock were suddenly conjured from the rock face, floated in midair across the cliff by an invisible string, and then made to disappear one by one around the bend. Among other odd sights, a mirage appeared near the river, phantom-like but real enough to rile the dogs, who made for the thing after it caught their eye. Perhaps 15 feet high, it glided over the lower pasture without casting a shadow. I grabbed the binoculars, searching the sky for a source, thinking it might be a drone or a trick of sunlight and a silhouette of hawks flying overhead. Instead, I spotted one of the dogs toting the dried remains of a horse's tail in his mouth. The dog skin withered along a bony finger, the coarse hair shaking like a talisman. I thought about taking it from the dog and keeping it, a creepy addition to a growing pile of found objects. Excuse me. But I considered it and then let the dog chew it to bits. The ranch had, when it was created by a fellow named David Sleeper, was all off the grid. There was no power to it. There still is no power to the ranch. The power actually ends about 7 miles east at Lajitas, and then doesn't pick up again until Redford, which is about 30 miles away. And so at one time, it was all, ranch land, and there were a few adobes that people lived in, and but in the late 80s, I believe, is when the Texas Parks and Wildlife started buying up a lot of that land, including Big Bend Ranch, which was a large sheep and goat operation in the 50s. And they bought a lot of that area, and so there was no further development from that point on, which including any kind of power grid. And so when the guy, that Sleeper, who was the guy that originally had the section along the river, started this ranch, he didn't want any power. He was the kind of guy, still is the kind of guy that lives off the grid, but he created this system on this ranch that was really, really quite remarkable, because the ranch really was self-sustaining. He raised horses and mules. He had a huge mule buyers network nationwide that he would raise these mules, and he would train them, and then he would sell these mules to outfitters in Colorado and Montana, and because they were really well-trained mules and they were very healthy. But he created this whole system in order to do that. He built this huge barn, and he built these rock corrals that are just hand-built, hand-stacked dry rock, beautiful. He was a welder, and he welded all kinds of stuff, and he set up a solar power system and welded his own solar panel structures that used temperature and hydraulics to slowly turn the panels without any electricity. It was quite amazing. And he set up this watering system that watered the whole place, but it was all spring fed, and it was all driven by gravity. There was no power or electricity to move this water from a spring about a mile and 3/4 up from the ranch headquarters, down to the ranch headquarters, up to the house, down to the corrals, and then finally out. He would use it to irrigate all these lower pastures and grow all his mule feed in these pastures, which of course are now fallow. But so it was really a remarkable place, and it had been abandoned. He had divorced and lost the ranch, and nobody lived there. Nobody was interested in it. So it had sat abandoned for a decade or more. And so all of these systems had stopped working. They hadn't been maintained, they hadn't worked. And so when Treviso moved out there, one of the things that he thought would be a great thing to do would be to bring all of these systems back in operation. And that was part of what I helped him do. And then when Parks and Wildlife stepped in and bought the 7,000 acres and made it part of Big Bend Ranch State Park, they contributed additional resources. And so now there is solar power, but there's still no grid power, and there's, your phone is a satellite line, and they drilled a well, and you get well water now instead of spring water, but it was just a really feat for this guy to do all by hand. And this guy didn't have a lot of money. He just knew how to figure out things. He was a real inventor. I mean, he was an inventor. We kind of jerry-rigged stuff. He was a creator, but. So this is a little bit about, what it actually took to kind of just to live there and deal with a place that's truly off the grid in the middle of, the West Texas. Because it really is a lot of work. I mean, it sounds fun, but it's work, it's not. A lot of it isn't fun. Life at Fresno included fence work, clearing brush, especially around the corrals to avoid run-ins with rattlesnakes, and boiling water at times for washing and bathing. The short-lived electricity supply limited the use of plugged-in appliances. Kerosene lanterns lit at dusk and dawn conserved energy and reduced the need to run the interior lights. After a year or so, the addition of a propane refrigerator kept food cold, reinstating our mini ice chests for beer only. The diesel generator supplemented the power, requiring one of us to have to dump 40-pound cans of fuel into the generator tank. It was my least favorite chore, especially during the early morning hours. Balancing a jerry can on the edge of the generator and maintaining consistent flow into the plastic funnel never came easy. My technique was sloppy, and the diesel fuel tank stank like baby oil and burnt molasses. Some repairs were beyond our abilities. If storms formed above the Sierra Rica Range and made it over the Rio Grande, the deluge made quick work of the leaky studio roof at a slight pitch and covered it in a layer of adobe dirt. Buckets caught the leaks if someone was home to position them. Otherwise, the rainwater pooled onto the concrete floor and evaporated, leaving behind powdery bentonite and the smell of wet creosote. Installing a small swamp cooler in the studio for the summer months helped fend off the heat. The solar battery system could power the cooler for a few hours, a little longer after the state park delivered the diesel generator, relocated from the hurricane-struck coast. We outfitted a 50-gallon barrel to feed water to the cooler, siphoning spring water from a 300-gallon container mounted in the bed of a pickup truck. Power to the swamp cooler never lasted all night, often making sleeping outdoors a cooler option, although not necessarily a more comfortable one. If temperatures remained stubbornly high, we'd forego the contraption and use the remaining power to run a small oscillating fan that didn't really do much more than push the hot air around. A wood-burning stove of unusual design heated this studio during winter. Instead of cutting the scarce wood on the ranch, we hauled it in from other places, including the deadwood from the collapsed ash trees on my Marathon property. The trees were down when I moved on to the place, big white trunks littering the ground like whale bones. Storm-felled salt cedar from around the Treviso family corrals in Presidio, 50 miles west of Fresno, supplied plenty of firewood. Salt cedar burns hot and fast, and the windfall provided enough heat to last 3 seasons. During a record freeze one winter, all the eucalyptus trees around the Treviso homestead froze back. Once cut and split, the deadwood made over a dozen cords. The scent of menthol hung in the air like in the studio air all season. The ranch's water supply depended on rain, spring flow, and runoff from the Bofacillos Mountains along the western rim of the canyon and the Solitario along the east. Its water delivery network consisted of a dam, spring box, canal, and pipeline integrated into the Fresno Canyon floor. The dam crossed the canyon a mile down from the studio below the highway bridge along FM 170, constructed of gravel, cement, and rock. When a flash clogged the system, the runoff traveled for a few days along its natural course down Fresno Canyon before disappearing underground, leaving the canyon a dry, stony arroyo from the dam all the way to the Rio Grande. As you can see from a lot of the images that I have hanging in the gallery, here in the gallery in the show, I photographed a lot of weather. I like photographing weather. A lot of people like photographing weather. It's a crazy phenomena, and you know, it looks good when you get the picture right. And so this last part I'll read is just a little bit about why, you know, kind of why I like photographing weather. Weather is in the Big Bend is a wily beast. A storm can rise in unexpected puffs, darkening a clear sky with menacing clouds, and then suddenly collapse and vanish, all in under an hour. Air currents, moisture, and temperature serve as the storm's co-conspirators, revising its characteristics in uncanny ways. Ice, wind, and electricity are its progenies, delivering hailstones on a balmy day, rolling the desert sands into flying debris, and striking the ground with 100 million volts. Storms unleash a force beyond our control, inspiring wonder and trepidation, rendering us mere spectators in a performance of immense power. Yet no matter how severe the action, storms release calm in their wake, delivering the seasons to our doorstep. Watching the evolution of a storm as it develops above a West Texas desert, where the wide open country allows an unobstructed view, delivers first-hand lessons in atmospherics, and offers an eyewitness account of nature's constructs. No two storms are the same, like most things in nature, but similar forces are at work in all of them. And once made familiar, they can be as decipherable as the silhouette of a bird against the pattern of leaves. Big Bend's weather illustrates the distinctive characteristics of basin and range geography. Shallows, valleys, cradled between desert mountains contribute to convection, causing warm air to rise and transfer heat to the atmosphere. The heat causes moisture in the air to condense and form cumulus clouds. Should the warm air continue to rise and create a thermal updraft, the towering clouds expand, producing conditions for hail and lightning. Rain, moisture too heavy to remain aloft, begins to fall, signaling the arrival of a cloudburst in full force. Lightning strikes are routine above West Texas, yielding enough transformative energy to cause fuel, typically dried vegetation, to spontaneously combust, a spectacle I witnessed while doing nothing more than sitting at the studio window with a view of the skies over the Sierra Ricas. In fact, lightning is hardly rare here or anywhere else. As one of the oldest of nature's observed events, lightning happens with such frequency that several hundred strikes will have occurred somewhere on the planet in the time it takes to read this sentence. When a lightning strike makes ground contact in a burst of flames, it's followed by a fat puff of smoke, as if a magician had suddenly made someone disappear. Cloudbursts at Fresno occupy the night skies as readily as the day. Electrical storms can equal the thrill of fireworks display, including the anticipation of an unplanned finale. But the night skies at Fresno are hypnotic regardless of the weather. The darkness feels time-traveled, casting unfamiliar eras in geography little changed over the centuries and made enigmatic by odd sounds and indecipherable shadows. The full moon transforms the mountain profiles and canyons into a satellite photograph, monochromatic, out of reach, confusing the known with the alien. A stumble from the bed and out the door to witness the night mid-act catches meteors routinely tumbling out of the skies, and alfalfa skittering among the cholla branches, globe lantern eyes like Marfa lights, bobbing up and bobbing down and circling around before blinking out. Clouds fill the horizon, heavier than wind but lighter than running water, and rain falls above distant peaks, raising springs from the canyon floor after we thought all had gone to ground. So that's me out of breath now. Does that, I'd like to open the floor up to questions. If anybody has any questions, don't be shy.
When did the Texas Parks and Wildlife purchase the ranch?
Fresno Ranch specifically?
Mm-hmm.
It was 2008, 2009. I think they started the process in 2008. And they bought it from the Norsworthy estate. Jean Norsworthy was the one that ended up with the ranch. And then after she passed away, it went through a lot of court. I think they had some legal issues.
Sure. And
the children weren't really interested in it, but they really didn't know what to do with it, I don't think. I mean, I may be wrong with that, but that seemed like the case.
And then after all the litigation, they just purchased it.
Yeah, and there may not have been any litigation. Maybe it just happened they needed to figure out who was going to get what and what they were going to do with it and how best they could sell it and who they were going to sell it to and all of that. I mean, it was a very large place in some place very far away, and Jean had always, my understanding is that Jean wanted it to become part of the state park, but she never did make those arrangements. And so when Mr. Treviso started working for the family, he was also working for Parks and Wildlife. In fact, he's here if you have any other questions. That's the cowboy sitting over there with the black hat. He can answer a lot of questions, and he's really good at making stuff up. Almost as good as I am. And so Nature Conservancy had a lot to do with that process as well. You know, the family, like Rod, they appreciated what he was doing to keep the place, you know, to keep an eye on the place. And because he was also working with Parks and Wildlife, they were a lot more friendly to the department, and then reconsidered making it part of Big Bend Ranch. It's really an integral piece of that park. If you've ever seen a map, or there's actually a map here in the book if you want to take a look at it, Fresno Ranch probably has more live water in more places than any other canyon in that state park, for whatever reason. And it always has been. It's really the canyon that drew a lot of the settlers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because of the proliferation of springs. Big Bend Ranch State Park, that whole region, which includes the Bofacillos Mountains and then a lot of the plateau above it, unlike the national park down, you know, which is merely down the road by 50 miles, has over 130 springs year-round, that flow year-round. They're either seeps or they're full running springs. They don't really depend on rainfall so much as because it's just the geography and the geology of the region is more conducive to holding water and releasing water. In the national park, it's far drier, and there are just not that many springs in the national park. And so to me, it was a much more interesting place, simply because it drew a lot more wildlife, or you were more likely to see the wildlife that's there because they were all going to be coming to the waters. So answer your question way more than.
No, it's great. And so the ranch itself is connected to the whole big
Correct.
Bend.
So originally the ranch had the Fresno Canyon kind of runs up all the way out through the ranch on the eastern half of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about 7,000 acres, and it goes all the way up. It just literally follows that canyon and on either side. And so David Sleeper, he had the ranch section, which is a 640 acre section along the river. That was actually the original Fresno Ranch. I mean, that was 1900 Fresno. That was Fresno Ranch, and it was just one section. And then he married Jean Norrisworthy. They met and fell in love and had a romance, and of course, people who know Jean Norrisworthy or know of her, that she was inherited a lot of money, married a lot of money, brought a lot of money to the relationship, divorced, and then met Sleeper out in West Texas, and then married him and brought a lot of her fortune with her and put it into Fresno. And a lot of the later paintings that she created, towards the last part of her career as a painter, were from Fresno. And the Sleeper built her this 2,000 square foot adobe painting studio, and that was where she painted. And so she was the one responsible for bringing the money to then buy the 9 more sections all the way up the canyon, because at that time they were all privately held. I mean, there was still privately held sections. Rancho de los Rios Canyon was beautiful. It was incredible, and it's still privately held in the interior of the state park, much like you would see in like older national parks in the mountain states. In Colorado, there's a lot of places in the Rocky Mountains that are in holdings, is what they call them. We don't call them that here in Texas, but that's essentially what they are. There are very few, but there are still some. So that's kind of what those sections were. And so now it joined all of the western edge, and then it also joined the eastern edge, which was the Solitario, the big dome that you could see from space. and that was already part of the state park. But both of those sides drain into this huge canyon, and that's probably part of the reason that it has so much water.
And Jean noteworthy, there's a book that Texas A&M Press
Yes.
has on her Healing Landscapes, which is, I believe, of the same ranch. Is it where you?
Yes. So the first part is about her family has a ranch outside Houston too. I think it's around Sealy, and that was
Yes.
kind of the home ranch and is the older ranch. And then she did a lot of that book. A lot of her early. The first half of the book is a paintings of that ranch. And then the second half of the book is when she met Sleeper and then moved out there. And so it's an interesting read from a different perspective.
Yeah. I love getting to hear more about the book and the ranch and the history. And really, I would encourage everyone to take a look at the book. We have them for sale up here, and I know EDN will be available afterwards for signing, for autographs, anything like that. But
It's on your arm.
But I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about your photography specifically, and kind of your
Sure.
process. As someone who does have a photography background and interest, I'm really have really taken by your pure landscapes and more minimalist imagery, but then the photo sequences, and then even the multi-panel ones where you're juxtaposing different images and compositions, and a lot of which are illustrated in the book as well. But just
Sure.
want to see if you could talk to us a little bit more about your process.
Sure, I'll be happy to. So, as you can see, a lot of these pieces are really big landscapes. A little bit of land, lots of sky, which is typical when you go out to Big Bend. That's what you're going to see. A little bit of land. I mean, we don't have big Rockies. They're desert mountains, basin and range. There's a range of mountains, and then there's basins in between them. So they never, at one time, millions of years ago, of course, they were huge, but they've all eroded away and become into these basins. And so most of what you get is the sky. But these basins really act like oven, a stovetop, and this is what heats up and creates a lot of these weather patterns. And so, you don't have to wait very long before you get some action. So, essentially I call these big square landscapes 16th century Dutch landscapes, because the 16th century painters, they did little land, big skies, and of course they had a lot of potato farmers in theirs, but I left all the potatoes farmers out of mine. They're influenced a lot, actually, more by painters than they are by other photographers. I studied a lot of the 19th century, 18th century painters, and people like Turner, who did very abstract skies, one of my favorites, and so I really wanted to kind of try to take that to expand on that point, to look at photography as a painter as opposed to looking at photography as a photographer. And so I look to painting to inspire me, essentially. So with these landscapes, that's essentially what I'm looking for. I'm trying to create a painting. I'm trying to create a very painterly feel with these big skies and the land. I do have a tendency to gravitate towards something a little more, even more abstract, but I kind of refrain myself from doing that, because I like the idea of having a sense of place. That's a huge part of why I live where I live, is because of that this is a real place for me. And what's interesting to me is, now that I've lived out there for almost 2 decades now, I've come to realize that people come out, and this a lot of times what I would do, I would go out and it would be like these beautiful vistas and it's gorgeous and it's beautiful. But living out there, you begin to understand that these landscapes are more than that, because people, have lived entire lives, on these landscapes. They've had families and they've had, joys and tragedies. And so excuse me. And so these landscapes, to me, the more I learn about the history of these places, the more I try to incorporate those feelings of, reading a story about, a couple of cowboys who, died in the influenza, at the right young age of 20 and 21. It's like, what was it like to be out in these landscapes 100 years ago on a horse, And the amazing thing is that living out there, I can walk out my backyard and I can look at vistas like these, like that one, for instance. And if it's, if there's a wind coming up and there's a dust storm or it's getting cold, you can just look at it and you can just feel the way that it must have been 100 years ago, because it just really hasn't changed, These places still look the same. There's no power lines, there's no, buildings, there's no homes. It's just the same, it's the same. So I really kind of draw on that. And of course, with having weather playing out, these drama playing out, it just makes it a lot more dramatic, because I love drama. So when I'm photographing for, for the gallery, or I'm trying to make some art, that's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this kind of drama and this intensity that, the weather performs a lot of that for me. I also make them big and square because, my German roots and everything is square when you're in German. And, but it also represents a window. So what I try to do is I try to, when I'm working on an image, I try to remember what it was like standing in front of this scene, and make sure that if I'm going to crop stuff, or if I'm going to, however I'm going to end up, with a finished image, I'm trying to remember what that scene looked like in my periphery, from one side all the way to the other, as opposed to just this, slice. I want it to be, I want the viewer to feel like that they're looking out a window at the real size of what the landscape was, as if you were standing there. So if you're standing in front of, where I was standing and taking this picture, this is exactly what it would look like. You would get all of this land, and in your, from your center vision all the way to your periphery. And I think that is part of what people are attracted to, is that when you see that, it is like looking into a window, into this other land. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Probably not. As far as the sequences, like the moons, I do have an art background. I did my undergraduate work at the University of North Texas. It wasn't in photography. I did my graduate work on a scholarship at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. It wasn't in photography. It was in time arts, is what they called it at the time. And it involved any kind of technology that you could use to explore the ideas of time and space. And so at that time, digital everything was just coming in to vogue, but I worked a lot in video and it's film and still doing a lot of photography. And so I really was in the whole idea of time and exploring how you can represent time just fascinated me, because it was really difficult. I mean, it was challenging, it was difficult, and how do you talk about the sequence of time, or you know, the meaning of time and how it relates to your life, you know, how do you represent that in an image, and how do you represent that in a work of art? And you know, it's difficult and it's a challenge. And so when I started thinking about that concept again, I really wanted to start bringing, I mean, because these landscapes really are, I mean, it's a moment, you know. This does not look like that 2 seconds before and 2 seconds after this happens. None of these are weather events, as you can imagine. It is really a micro moment. And so I thought, well, how can I begin to explore the idea of expanding those moments, but still in a single image, rather than in a film or in a video, and so I thought about, you know, and I still wanted it to relate to a sense of place and where I lived and what I experienced in life. And so the moon just kind of came up. You know, the moon is a crazy thing, and it means a lot to a lot of different people. And so I thought, well, why don't I start photographing the moon rising or the moon setting over this period of time, and then using a visual sequence, which is the grid, to then begin to try to define what that looks like and what that means. And so that's how these sequences kind of came about. And then I kind of moved, I thought about, well, how can I describe time and space? You know, because space is a big part of time. And so I thought about how to create an image that begins to explore that. I'm not saying that I was successful always at being able to describe those things, but how do I set up a structure for myself to explore those ideas? And so that's where the kind of these mosaic pieces came in. If you see the one of the self-portrait with the dog in the back of my thing, and there's the couple of the trees, and so everything that you see that has multiple images on it, they're all composed of individual photographs. So every section or segment of these photographs, once they're a complete composition, are individual photographs then put together. And that gave me the idea of that's how Cubists paint. Cubists paint different angles or different perspectives, and they confine those perspectives in some kind of, you know, of grid. Essentially, it may not be, you know, an exact grid, but it's in a shape, four-sided shape or a circle, some kind of geometry. And I thought, well, how that's a good way, I mean, that's a good starting point, is to look at the Cubists and see how they looked at perspective, and they would, you know, paint part of you from here, and then they go over to the side and paint part of you from here. And so I started photographing that way, and started photographing the subject from here and from the side and from above or from below, or you know, from a series of just walking and photographing and walking and photographing. And then I would layer them one on top of the other, much the same way that a painter would then just take pieces of it. And so that's kind of how these mosaics come about. And so what I'm essentially trying to do is just create kind of a Cubist idea of photography, or approaching photography as a Cubist. It's very formal, very dry, formal. It's none of this, oh, I'm gonna do like this. I have to have these very sequential, linear ideas of how I approach making art, because that's the challenge for me.
But they also seem, in a way, very studied and composed, in that there's some time spent maybe moving them around and figuring out if that belongs there. And
yes. Yes, and it's a lot easier with photography because you're not scraping paint off and then repainting the section. You can pick and choose, and you can scrape away a cube in a multi-layered image, and you can get down to the layer that actually gives it that it starts to mess with the perspective a little bit. those are new. That's kind of a new thing for me. That's, you know, so it's still kind of an exploratory stage, but it's
great.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. But it's interesting to me. It's, you know, it's tedious, technical stuff, but long hours in front of a screen. But, you know, it beats the long hours in front of an easel with a pencil doing, oh no, eraser out, no. So that's kind of where I'm at as a photographer.
Thank you so much. We
Well, thank you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody.